This is the Panasonic Lumix GH6, and the biggest problem with this camera is the battery. So this is the battery that it uses, and it runs at around 1 hour after usage. If I try to conserve the battery, by switching settings, using low frame rates, not using continuous autofocus, then it might last marginally more than 1 hour. But if you have this camera, the reason you want to use it is because you want to use all the features. So switching it off doesn't make sense. But I just want to mention that this is the GH5 Mark II, and this camera has the exact same battery. And I managed to run this camera, the GH5 Mark II, for over 2 hours, and while I'm using Wi-Fi and streaming video over Wi-Fi. So the GH6 is great, but the battery power on it runs out really quickly. Now the second problem with the GH6 is that it doesn't have a battery grip, so you can't buy an external battery grip and attach it to the bottom of the camera and get double the runtime. Whereas this is something you can do with the other Panasonic cameras or any other camera. So what you can do is use USB to power the camera. So there's a USB-C port here, which you can use to power the camera. So if you have a power bank or a V-mount battery, you can convert it to USB-C, or if it's a power bank and it directly gives you USB-C, you can use that to power the battery or charge the battery as well. The problem with running the camera from USB-C is that when you switch on the camera, it takes a long time for it to switch on. So you need to negotiate with the power bank whether it can provide the required voltage or not. Let me just try to show this. So if I switch on the camera, this sign here which says how long it has left, that's when it actually checks the memory card, so it tells you how much runtime you have left. So if I switch it off and switch it on again, so 1, 2, 3, so roughly about 3 seconds, the camera is ready to start recording. So if I switch this off and then switch it back on while I'm powering it with USB-C, let's see how long it takes to power on. Okay, so this is my USB power bank, and I'm going to plug it into the USB-C port and now switch it on. 1, 2, 3. So now it's doing this, it's checking the USB, and then you have to select what you want to do. So you want PC storage, tether, or picked bridge. So I don't want any of those, so I just go out of it, and then it's checking again. So this whole process takes longer than expected. And now you can see there's a small icon above the battery which indicates that it's being powered from the USB-C. Another problem with the GH6 is the battery door. So if you look at the battery door here, you have this, let's see if I can show this. You have this thing that opens up, this flap, and you can run a dummy battery through there to deal with the problem of the low battery life. Have a dummy battery and then connect it to either a direct power or through an external battery supply. So this one requires the specific Panasonic one for it to work. Whereas with previous models, it didn't have this flap here. Instead, you had a little cut here where any cable could just fit through. So for the GH6, you need a specific dummy battery connection that needs to be able to get through this flap. So let me just show what the GH5 Mark II had. So this is the GH5 Mark II, and if you look, there's a small cut there. So if I open the battery door, I can actually do this. So you can see that flap would allow any cable to go through there. So you could buy third-party dummy batteries to use with this camera. So if you want to power the GH6 for an extended period of time, the best option is to obviously rig up the camera with a V-mount battery, but it would make the camera heavy because you need to connect, all the metal parts to make the V-mount battery stand. Another option is Tilta creates these base plates where you would have the base plate and a side part, and then you can fit the V-mount battery in there. So you don't actually need to rig up the whole camera. You could just buy that and then use any V-mount battery with that. And there's a few companies that provide batteries that actually screw into the bottom of the camera or cage if you're using a cage. So that would be the lightest way to deal with the problem of short battery life on this camera. Another problem with this camera is the streaking issue, which lots of people have spoken about. So if you have a really high contrast scene with extreme bright conditions and extremely dark conditions in the same scene, some of the light will seep through to the darker parts of the image. And in my experience, I've never had such a scenario, and if it has been, it hasn't been something that I've actually noticed. So to me, that's not a real problem, but I just thought I mentioned that because a lot of people have spoken about it. And it seems to be the degree of how much light seeps through to the sides, and this only happens on a horizontal side of the image, seems to differ between different cameras. So even though they're all GH6 cameras, when they go through the manufacturing process, some of them are slightly different. So a few things about that. To solve that problem, you can't completely solve it, but it's worse in higher ISOs. So if you can keep your video in lower ISOs, then you'll see less of that problem. The other thing is, if you switch on DR boost, then the problem will be lessened as well. And they've also done some firmware update, which is in version 2.2 onwards, which improves that even further. So if you encounter this problem, just make sure you're on firmware 2.2 and higher. Don't use high ISO settings, and switch on DR boost when you can. Another problem with this camera is that for SD cards, it supports V90 SD cards, but it's capped the speed to 600 megabits per second. So if you look at all the different, so for example, this one is 800, but if we look at, so 600 megabits per second is the maximum bit rate that you get where you can actually write to the SD card. So a V90 SD card will easily work with 720 megabits per second, which is according to the specification. So instead of catering to the camera owner's need and conforming to the standards of SD, which is 720 megabits per second, Panasonic has limited this to 600 megabits per second because apparently some SD cards don't support 720. So the companies that have manufactured those have actually not abided by the standard. So they've created low quality SD cards that can't write 720 megabits per second, and they sold it off as memory cards that can reach that type of speed. So it's almost like Panasonic has accommodated the dodgy card manufacturers instead of conforming to the standard and what's best for the customer. This is something that obviously they can update with a firmware update and provide a higher bit rate, because it makes a difference. So if you want to go to 800 megabits per second, then you can no longer have dual recording, or you cannot save to the SD card, so you need to use the CF Express card. So whenever you're filming with high bitrate codecs, you're not going to be able to write to both memory cards at the same time, so you won't have redundancy. Which begs the question, what is the point of having the CF Express card and an SD card if it kind of reduces the option to being able to write to both of them when you're using high bitrate options? Because the camera also has SSD writing, so you can actually record externally to the SSD through the USB-C cable. Other problem with this camera is that since you have two different types of memory cards, so this is a CF Express card, and this is a SD card. This is actually a V30 SD card. And even though according to the standard, it only supports 240 megabits per second, I'm using it to write 300 megabits per second to it without any problems, which is why it's annoying that they've limited the SD card writing to 600 megabits, because according to the standard, it supports 700 megabits per second, but it could obviously even go faster than that, substantially faster than that. So the problem with having two different types of memory cards is, first of all, you have to carry two different type of memory cards, SD cards and CF Express card, which is inconvenient. But in terms of also your workflow, you have more things to worry about. So if your memory cards are running out, you need to think which one is running out, which one do I need to switch, take out of my bag. So you have to care for the type of memory card. And then you also need different card readers for these. And you, for example, if you come from previous models of Panasonic Micro Four Thirds camera, then you would already have SD cards, whereas with the CF Express cards, now you actually have to go and buy those, so it becomes more expensive as well. And it doesn't streamline the work process as well. So if you want to avoid the cost of having to buy CF Express cards and CF Express card readers, you can obviously record externally to an SSD, but that has some limitations as well. So when you're recording to an SSD, you won't be able to record simultaneously to the memory card. So you still won't get redundancy. Also, if you want to record to an SSD and you want to record frame rates higher than 60, then you need to use a dummy battery with a charger that's plugged into the wall. So you won't be able to get those types of speeds with a battery in the camera and write externally to the SSD. Also, if you're recording externally via HDMI, so the camera has an HDMI cable, so you can HDMI port, so you can use this to connect to an external recorder. So this could be one of those monitors that also allows you to record, or it could even be your smartphones, because a lot of smartphones actually let you record now as well, so you can use them. And again, if you're using HDMI with fast frame rates, so if you're recording 120 frames per second, you won't be able to record internally to the memory cards at the same time. And the same is true for raw video. So if you're putting out raw video via HDMI, you can't record internally to the memory cards at the same time neither. So you have lots of options to store, but redundancy is not practical unless you're on the lower frame rates. So you can record the video with HDMI. You can do it with SSD through the USB-C port. And you have two different types of memory cards which you can write to. So there's lots of options. It's just that the redundancy is a little bit limited. And I think Panasonic has realized that they made a mistake with the GH6 to have a CF Express card, because on the S5 II and S5 IIX, they still have two SD card slots, which shows that that's the route they want to go in the future. And then just use SSD recording or HDMI recording for those really high throughput codecs. The ergonomics of this camera isn't that great, in my opinion. So I find that Canon cameras and Olympus high-end cameras have better ergonomics. For example, on the back of this camera, you have this dial, and I tend to hit it accidentally. And you have way too many buttons here. That's easy to hit and touch when you're operating the camera. So I tend to hit this dial in particular quite frequently. So what I have done is I've set up this button here, the delete button, to lock the screen and lock the buttons. So what I can do is I press it to lock everything and press this again to unlock it. But then it's a little bit inconvenient because every time I want to change something, I need to unlock it before I change anything. The other annoying thing about this camera is these things that connect to the eyelets for connecting a strap to it. So I've taken out the triangles, but they tend to hit against the camera and they make noise. So the first thing I do is take them out immediately. But The other thing is because they protrude, they actually get in the way when if you want to carry a small camera and put it in the bag. These protrusions actually make the camera require more space than it would need otherwise. And I think Canon cameras and really old Olympus DSLR cameras, they had this thing which was it's just essentially there's a groove and a place where you could connect a neckband directly to it, so without having to use triangles, because it would be like a wide opening. And obviously they don't make any sound which could be recorded in the video, and they also don't protrude more than the body, the size of the camera itself. So that would be the better approach. So yeah, I mean, this is exactly the thing. So I'm using a cage right now, but if you look here, this is the type of thing that they should have as part of the camera. So you can connect the neckband there directly, and then you won't need to use a metal triangle which creates noise, and that noise will be recorded on the video. So the screen of this camera is quite good because you can lift it up, but the only annoying thing about it is that you can't reach 90 degrees. So it comes up, but it only seems to come up to around, so it has two places. One is around, I think, 30 degrees and another place for around 45 degrees. Whereas in my experience, I would want it to reach 90 degrees so I can actually look down when I'm holding the camera close to my body. So they've made a good screen because it's both a flip screen and you can also tilt it, but the tilt isn't enough. It should be at least 90-degree tilt so that if you're holding it down close to your body, you can actually look down and see it clearer. So with this camera, you can buy a module, an adapter which you connect to the hot shoe, and that will let you connect multiple microphones and record all of those. But if you haven't connected that and you're recording video, you still get 4 audio channels regardless. And if you're going in your video editing tool, you have to actually remove those. So that's an annoying thing, and I think that's something that they could fix as part of a firmware update. Another thing about this camera is that it's quite unresponsive, particularly when we want to start recording. So let's just say I turn on the camera, and it takes about 3 seconds for the camera to be ready to operate. And if I press the record button and then stop it and then press it again, okay, I mean, it seems to be working responsively now. But sometimes when I want to start recording, immediately after I turn on the camera, and then I need to stop recording or I press it again because it doesn't look like it's starting to record, I find that the camera is a little bit unresponsive. Another problem with this camera is HDMI cable is connected to an external monitor, and the info display is turned on. The info won't be shown on the camera LCD screen, so you can only see it on the external monitor. Let me see if I can replicate this. So you have the microphone levels there, and the aperture, frame rate, ISO, card details, battery, and that's the histogram. But obviously because the lens cap is on, you can't see anything. But all the information is shown here, but nothing on the screen. So if I, for example, press menu, you can see the menu here and on the external display, but the information for recording is only shown on the external display and not on the camera itself. That's not a big problem, but it's a little bit of an inconvenience. Another problem is that when you're using an external monitor, the frame rate on the external monitor through the HDMI drops significantly, and as soon as you stop recording, the frame rate reverts back to the original frame rate, which is supposed to be. And sometimes if you turn off and turn on the camera, it seems to go away temporarily and then it comes back. So I'm not entirely clear what the issue is, but it seems to happen if you're using Vlog through HDMI 4K 24p with 422 10-bit all intra. So it might be to do with the data rate that needs to go through the processing of the camera and the buses and through the HDMI. So the camera has no choice to drop frame rates on the HDMI channel to be able to cope with writing all of that information to the cards. And this is just for monitoring, so we're not talking about recording to an external device via HDMI. One more inconvenience with this camera is that if you want to change frame rates, for example, switch from 60 frames per second to 50 frames per second, you can't do it through choosing it on the menu. You actually have to go out of the recording options and then go into the setting and change the system frequency. So the frame rates are essentially linked to the system frequency of the camera. So the camera literally runs at one of these frequencies. So if you want to get different recording options in terms of frame rates, then you have to change the camera's system frequency. And then once you do that, so let me just do that. So I'm going from NTSC to PAL, and then I have to restart the camera before it works. So now I have to switch off the camera and then switch it back on. And then if I go to the menu now, the recording options are 50p. So even though I mentioned a lot of problems with this camera, all of these problems are insignificant. I would say the biggest one is the battery life, which is low, which is expected when you have a camera that has so many features, and it can shoot high frame rates, raw video, it writes 2 cards at the same time, have a LCD screen that has high refresh rate. So all of these features makes it quite power hungry. So if I'm recording video and I don't mind carrying external batteries and rigging up my camera, then the GH6 is still my go-to camera. But whenever I want to have a Lite setup and I don't want to rig up my camera with batteries and take USB cables and dummy batteries with me, then I won't use the GH6 just for that single reason that I have to carry heavy batteries with me, and it just makes my whole kind of setup a bit more cumbersome. I wanted to mention a few things about the GH5 Mark II. And I think if you're not using the features of GH6, the GH5 Mark II is probably a better option for most people, unless you're using the specific features that the GH6 provides, for example, 4K 120p with sound without crop, which is something that not a lot of cameras do. So if you're using those features, then obviously the GH6 is the better choice. But there's a few things about the GH5 Mark II which is actually better in my opinion than the GH6. And one of them is that it has 2 SD cards. And the advantage of that is that you just have a single type of card, whether you want to write, have redundancy, or whether you want to loop through 2 cards, you switch them off, and it just streamlines the work. You have one type of card reader that you need to worry about. So the streaming functionality is one of the advantages of the GH5 Mark II. So you can go into streaming function and you can stream directly with Wi-Fi. So if you have access to Wi-Fi, you just enter the details on your camera and then you can stream directly. In terms of being smaller, lighter, that's another advantage as well. So to me, it has advantages, and that's, being smaller and lighter, having 2 SD cards, and also being able to stream over Wi-Fi as well as network. So you can also stream with the GH6, but it means you need extra equipment. So for example, what you can do is you can have a HDMI cable connect to a video capture card, which is what I have here, and then connect this to, let's just say, for example, a smartphone, and then stream through there. The point is that you need kind of, extra devices, and just makes it a little bit more cumbersome. Whereas with the GH5 Mark II, being able to do it over Wi-Fi is really nice, because all you do is you can connect your camera to your hotspot on your phone, for example, and then do your streaming with, high quality. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions.